I'm Will Kline. Today we are at Gramophone in Timonium, Maryland. This is one of my favorite showrooms, absolutely breathtaking. And we're going to be doing a setup training for Sonus faber loudspeakers. Now this is a training that we give to all of our dealers. We want to make absolutely sure that every customer has the best experience whenever they come into one of our dealer showrooms. So we make sure that our dealers are well versed in the methodology that we use for placing speakers properly, both in the showroom and in a customer's home. Really looking forward to this training. We can take any environment. I don't care if you're putting a pair of bookshelf speakers onto a bookshelf, right? I don't care if you're setting something up in a corner on either side of a fireplace, in a half room with a half wall, any type of environment you get into, we can use this technique and get the best possible sound from that environment. And with this technique, it's going to be 5 very simple steps. This song is incredibly beneficial. That's why it's still used to this day. I've been doing this for 25 years, still use this song. This song is incredibly beneficial because it has all the information that we need to do all 5 of these steps. So this is The Ballad of the Runaway Horse, Jennifer Warren. This is actually off of the Rob Wasserman Duets album, as opposed to the Jennifer Warren's album, where it's a studio recording and not nearly as useful. One of the things you'll notice when I first came in today is I just found myself a Centerpoint. All right, so I went ahead and measured equidistant from each of the sidewalls, and I put myself a couple of speakers here so that the listening position can be perfectly lined up. Ideally, when you've got a good setup, especially if it's going to be in someone's home, they shouldn't need to be perfectly in the sweet spot to be able to really enjoy the 3-dimensional nature of the sound. In fact, I find that to be a flaw in your speakers. If you have to be in one particular spot to really enjoy the speakers, there's something wrong with them. So we want to essentially have the same distance between the 2 speakers as we do from each of the speakers to the listener, give or take. I find that in most cases, that's going to skew based on the width of the room. Right? It might be a little bit wider in wider rooms, a little bit less wide in less wide rooms. Make sure I've got some sort of a stable position that I can listen from, that I know is going to be exactly the same every time I revisit it. All right? Again, we want to eliminate as many variables as possible. So the next thing is I want to figure out, based on the closest boundary, which tends to be the front wall, but it's not always necessarily the front wall. And I've actually used sidewalls as reinforcement just as well. But I essentially want to adjust the distance of the speakers to the first boundary. Right? And this is the most important part of the technique, because this is where you get not only your bass propagation capabilities, how low will the speaker go, it's also what frequencies will the room support. Low frequency extension in a given piece of music, that essentially creates the click. That low frequency is essentially the click that our brain interprets as the reflection off of those hard surfaces. All right, so one of my favorite demos to do is a single piccolo recording, recorded in a symphony hall. All right, so we know the piccolo is simply not capable of low frequency. There is no low frequency, right? This is a subwoofer demo. So we listen to the piccolo. It sounds absolutely beautiful. It's on Sonus faber speakers. Of course, it sounds beautiful. And then we click the subwoofer on. And all of a sudden, what was a beautiful painting becomes a fully rendered sculpture. All right, it's not just a piccolo playing in thin air. It's a piccolo player standing on the stage. And you can hear the walls in your listening room open up, and all of a sudden it sounds like it's 30 feet to that corner, 30 feet to that corner, and 50 feet to that corner. Right? You can hear the room even though you can't hear the room, just because that recording, that piccolo, that instrument in that space, was activating the lowest fundamental frequency that that space is capable of rendering. All right, so that's what paints the picture, that's what makes it real, and that's why bass is so important. Because if we don't have the bass right, it's impossible to render a proper 3-dimensional sculpture. We start fairly close to this surface, right? And we call this the front wall. So we're starting fairly close to the front wall. And then we're going to literally slide the speaker forward to look for the best bass. Right? How do we define the best bass? For me, there's 3 L's. First and foremost, we want the bass to be low, right? As low as we can go. Second, when we've got the bass properly reinforced by the nearest boundaries, it will also be loud, because the information being propagated by the drivers is synchronizing with the information that's being reflected by the wall before it hits the listener. What we're trying to do is essentially synchronize the front wave in the lowest fundamental frequency of the room with the reflected wave. The third L is linear. On step 1, we're just moving one speaker. So the other speaker is going to be playing because the way that the energy reacts in a room is going to be dramatically different if you're just playing one speaker versus playing both of the speakers, right? And essentially all we're doing during step 1 is we're very, very, very slowly moving the speaker forward into the room, right? We want to make sure that we're moving at a perpendicular angle just to, again, eliminate variables, right? So we want to basically keep the same distance off of this side wall for this particular step. So rather than moving it toward the listener, I'm going to be moving it toward the opposite side of the room. But when I find a spot that I like, I'm going to try the spot behind it, try the spot in front of it, settle on this. Okay, this is pretty darn good. Mark that position, and ideally we don't move that speaker. So one of the other things we can listen for in this step is the way that the sound opens up into the room. Right? And the best way to describe it for me is if you've ever listened to a stand-up bass, and then you listen to it while the player has his knee against it, right? Those overtones, that natural ring of that wood doesn't happen. It's deadened, right? When the speaker is in the wrong relationship with one of the boundaries, its own sound waves are deadening that information, right? So its own reflection becomes the knee that's on that bass, preventing it from ringing out naturally. Right? So when I'm at the speaker and I'm doing my adjustments, that's the primary thing that I'm listening for. I'm listening for a lack of that pressure on the sound and for that sound to just flourish out into the room naturally. Step 2 is closing the gate. So imagine we're dropping like a post, and then we're just gonna close the gate. All right? So this speaker is the post, this speaker is the gate. All essentially we're doing is moving this speaker into the same position that that one's in. All right, now in a symmetrical room like this, you can absolutely just measure your distance from the back wall and start there, but it always behooves you to adjust it a little bit this way, a little bit that way, because you never know how perfectly symmetrical something is. And even if it is visually symmetrical, we don't know what's behind those walls that might be affecting that low frequency. When this speaker is locked in, it's going to sound like essentially the stand-up bass is over here somewhere in between, closer to this speaker, maybe right on this speaker. Right? And by sliding this one forward, we're actually going to transition the sound of that bass right into the center. Right? And when we've properly focused, when we've properly brought that speaker, properly closed the gate, not only is that bass going to be low, loud, and linear, all right, it's also going to be much punchier. You're going to feel that attack. You're going to feel it on your chest because essentially we're lining up both of these waves so that they smack into you at the same time. All right? So there should be more impact. It should be visceral. It should be physical. Now, one of the things that I often see that's completely overlooked is this step 3, the distance of the speakers from each other. And the distance of the speakers from each other is not only going to control how large or small instruments in the soundstage sound, it's also going to control how separated they sound in the soundstage. Right? So what we're trying to get is we're trying to get enough focus that we can really hear the clarity in between all of the instruments, regardless of how many instruments there are, regardless of the space it was recorded in. If the speakers are not the proper distance from each other, I can tell from down the hallway. Right? There's going to be a diffuse nature, there's going to be a lack of detail, and it's just going to sound like it's not focused. But when we're sliding the speakers towards each other or away from each other, again, we want to make sure that we're not sacrificing any of the distance, any of that calibration that we made between the speaker and the wall behind it, right, in that first quarter. We want to make sure that we're sliding the speakers directly toward each other and we're not angling them in one direction or another, because obviously if we lose this distance, if this isn't exactly where we left it, we're going to lose that nice bass that we just created. So for this technique, there's actually a little trick we can use with the vocals. So this will be the first step where we actually start listening to the vocals. It's really a matter of identifying the singer in the presentation and the size of her mouth. Right? Because when the speakers are not the proper distance from each other, her mouth is going to sound like it's about yay big. Right? It's just going to be diffused. It's going to be all over the place. Right? But by bringing those speakers into the correct distance from each other, you can literally get it to sound like all of her voice is coming straight through the sides of her mouth. Right? We're really actually literally trying to visualize the singer's face and getting all of the sound to come from as concise of space as possible. And in this case, I find like in most cases, it's like every 2 to 4 inches, you're gonna find a perfect spot. You mark that spot and you keep coming, see if you can find something that gives you something a little bit better. The next step, after we've adjusted the binoculars, right, is we need to focus the binoculars. And this is where we start to address toe. So when we're addressing toe, we're not just thinking about, okay, the propagation of the tweeter, the propagation of the mid-range driver and the woofers, how they're going to be directed into the room and how they're going to interact with the listener, right? What you're doing moreover with this step is you're actually windowing out the sidewall reflections, right? So the more I have the speaker aimed toward the wall, the more of the information that you're listening to is actually coming from the wall, right? And less of it from the speaker. Now there's an optimal amount. You don't actually want to listen to a stereo system in an anechoic chamber. You don't want complete absorption everywhere. There's a certain amount of reflection that will add to the breadth, to the depth, to the width of the soundstage. Right? So we want that information. Speakers are designed to work with that information. But if we've got too much of it or too little of it, we're going to have the wrong size soundstage. And everything is going to be diffused and confused, as they would say in Italy. But this is where we actually start to get into a little bit of subjectivity, because certain speakers, certain rooms, and certain electronics are going to have different tonality than others. Right? Some stuff is going to be a little bright, a little sibilant sounding. Right? Some of it's going to be a little dark, a little bit subdued, a little too laid back. And this is actually a technique that you can use. This is one of the steps that you can use to make adjustments accordingly. So if I want a little bit of a sharper sound, in most speaker manufacturers, right, if I'm setting up almost anybody else's speakers, I'm going to wind up towing the speakers more toward the listener. All right, with Sonus faber, it's almost exactly the opposite. Because of our Dapex dome tweeter technology, even if you point our tweeters directly at the listener, they will never become harsh, brittle, or overbearing in the high frequency, right? And in fact, most Sonus faber speakers, in most rooms I should say, they want to be towed almost exactly toward the listener. I've even done setups where they were kind of crossed in front of the listener, all right, just based on what the sidewalls were made out of. So after that, there was one step, and this is another one that's often overlooked. And I have found that while it is very effective on almost any speaker, right, maybe not a line array, but any pinpoint speaker, and that is the rake angle, right? So just what we were doing with the toe, we're essentially windowing out the sidewalls. We're going to do the exact same thing with the floor and the ceiling, right? Just by adjusting the rake angle, the tilt forward or backward of the speaker. And what we're listening for in this step is the same things we were listening to when we were adjusting the toe, but rather than listening to them from a left and right perspective, which is to say, when I'm adjusting the toe, I can listen to the speakers, I can bob my head to the left a little bit, I can hear this speaker, I can bob my head to the right a little bit, hear that speaker, and notice and look for any changes between the two, right? Because we want them to be symmetrical. And once we have them symmetrical, then we want to see if maybe we want to globally adjust the toe more or globally give us less toe, right? Same thing when we're doing step 5 with the rake, right? But instead of moving my head side to side, now I'm going to be moving my head up and down. All right, so I'll come down here, maybe 6 or 8 inches, and then I'll scoot up in the listening position 6 or 8 inches, and I'm listening to the variance. All right, so the first thing is I want to make sure that both of them are symmetrical, and then I want to listen to what I prefer. And again, this is a step where it does become subjective. All right, so some folks are going to like to come up here. They're going to say, okay, it's a little more dry sounding here. The instruments are separated a little bit better. I like this. All right. Some folks are going to dip down into their chair. It's going to be a little more liquidy sounding. It's going to be a little bit more cohesive sounding, and you might prefer that. So one of the most important takeaways for me, and I don't know if this applies to everybody, is to listen with your heart. That's one of the things my old boss in music lovers used to say to me. It never really made sense at first. But it really is about actuating your subconscious by stopping thinking, right? By stopping the thoughts, the conscious thoughts that make it so that you trip over your feet if you're running down the stairs. So as we go through these steps, you shouldn't necessarily need to spend more than 3 or 5 seconds making these determinations. right? Because we're not thinking, okay, this variable plus this variable plus this variable, okay, that's good sound. What we're thinking is, okay, blue shirt, black shirt, I like the blue one better. That's it, right? You want to try to eliminate the things that require advanced processing, right? We want to make it very, very simple, A or B decisions. It's always great to start with irrational proportions if it is possible, but there's no way you're going to pull out a piece of notebook paper and tell me where my speakers belong. Okay? You have to listen. You have to do the trial and error. You have to go through it, regardless of what the math says. Somebody comes in here with frequency scanners and lasers and tells you, okay, there's got to be one speaker right there. It's got to be a 13-degree tilt. There's going to be one speaker right there at 14-degree tilt. That's right. Your ceilings are off. Okay, you put them there. Does it sound good or does it not? If it doesn't sound good, it doesn't sound good. It's a matter of what the computer says. That was awesome. So hopefully you guys got a chance to see some of the techniques that we use when placing speakers, both in the showroom and in a customer's home. I could not have had a better time here at Gramophone. The guys have been absolutely gracious and super hospitable. So thank you for your time, and thanks to everybody here at Gramophone.